All right, so in this video, we are going to talk about how you can wholesale properties that have tenants or squatters inside of them. So yes, to answer your question, you can most definitely wholesale a property that has a tenant or a squatter. They're definitely wholesalable. I don't know if that's a word, but we'll use it. You can wholesale a property with a tenant or squatter. I've done it numerous times, okay? In fact, you can get the best deals that way too. So if you come across a property, you can wholesale it even though it has a tenant or squatter. And in this video, I'm gonna show you how you can do that. All right, so if you're in the wholesale game, it's inevitable you're gonna come across a property that has all the characteristics to be distressed property. The grass is gonna be high, it's gonna be boarded up, there's gonna be tarp on the roof, needs a paint job, might look vacant, liens, violations, whatever the case may be. Whatever distressed property is, you're gonna come across it. However, you are going to run into the fact that there is going to be a tenant or a squatter, okay? So when you come across that situation, there are ways that you can definitely still wholesale the property to the end buyer, and the end buyer still is going to want to take on that property. All right, so some of the things that you can do to make that property wholesalable is, one, you can do what is cash for keys, all right? So if you never heard of this term cash for keys, that's when you give the tenant or squatter some money to move out the property. It's as simple as that, okay? However, it's not necessarily all that simple, because there's going to be situations where you don't know how much money they're willing to take. So you kind of have to fill them out. Just start low, start at like $2,000, to kind of fill them out. But yeah, you can give them cash for keys. This is a lot easier with someone who's kind of on a month-to-month lease, right? And they are, they don't mind moving out. They know that it's about to happen. They know the property is being sold. It's a lot harder to get someone who's living in there for free to move out by cash for keys. So that's when it gets a little tricky, because why would they accept cash when they're living there for free? So the cash for keys, it definitely works. I've done it. You just have to know the situation of the tenant. It works more for tenants than squatters, because squatters, basically, they don't really care for money. They just want shelter, right? But when you're dealing with the tenant who's month to month, or the lease is going to expire really soon, so they may be on like a 12-month lease, but it's going to expire very soon, right? So you can say, hey, here's $2,000, here's $5,000. Can you move out before we close? All right, so cash for keys is definitely a way to wholesale properties with tenants inside, and the end buyer would definitely bring that up as well. They say, hey, like, would they be willing to accept some money to leave early, to leave before closing? So negotiate that with the end buyer and the tenant. If you don't have money to give, then just have the end buyer take care of it, okay? Just have the end buyer put up the cash for keys, and you may have to take a little bit off of your assignment fee, but hey, at least you got the tenant out, or at least the tenant is going to be out before closing, which is what most end buyers are going to want anyway. All right, so the next thing you can do to wholesale a property with tenants is to evict. So you can do an eviction to get the tenants out, or the squatter, right? So you can wholesale that property. Now, when it comes to evictions, depending on where you are, this can be a pain in the ass. I'm just gonna be transparent. If you are in a landlord-friendly state, mainly a red state, okay, which I have a video on that as well, which states are the landlord-friendly states and which ones aren't. The landlord-friendly states are mainly the red states, like Florida, for one, that's my market. An eviction process can be a whole hell of a lot easier than a state that's not landlord friendly like New York, okay? So the eviction process will help you be able to sell that wholesale property to that end buyer. However, that being said, you want the seller to take care of this eviction process, all right? You want the seller to evict the tenant or squatter first before closing, all right? That way you can deliver the property vacant to the end buyer. And that's what the end buyer is going to want too. They want that property to be vacant. They don't want anybody inside of it. So once they take, possession of that property, they can then just start flipping it or turning it into a rental, whatever they want to do with it. So you want to negotiate in your contract with the seller to do the eviction before closing, all right? And that's if the seller has a tenant who refuses to move out or a squatter who refuses to move out. Now, let's just say, okay, the property, the seller doesn't want to do the eviction. They don't have the money to do the eviction. They're not familiar with the process. You will come across that too. And this is where you can come in to solve the problem. You can be the superhero in the situation. So what you do when the seller can't do the eviction, you then negotiate with the seller a reduction so you will take on that eviction. And when I say you, I mean the end buyer, okay? So if you go to the end buyer and then you tell them it has a tenant, it has a squatter, the seller isn't willing to evict them, they don't have the money to do it, that end buyer is gonna be like, okay, that's fine, I need a reduction in price. Which is fine, that's great. That's another opportunity for you to make money, okay? So the end buyer is going to want a reduction in price. All right. So then before you have that reduction in price with the end buyer, you then need to go to the seller and ask for a reduction in price. Okay. It's a perfect opportunity to be able to make more money on these distressed properties when you're able to negotiate reductions, because you are taking on that headache that the seller doesn't want to take on. Right? So because you are solving a difficult problem, you are able to make more money. All right? So if that end buyer is not willing to take on that eviction to close on the property with that tenant or squatter inside, which is understandable because I've actually had to evict a lot of tenants and squatters. It's a pain in the ass. It can take time. Luckily, because I'm in Florida, it doesn't take as much time as if I was in like a blue state like New York or whatever. But it still takes time, all right? That's still days that, I'm losing money on to be able to get my contractor in there and get the work done so I can put it up for sale to flip or to cash out refinance on the rental. So because the eviction takes time, the end buyer's not going to want to do that. That's fine. Like I said, the end buyer's going to want a reduction in price. Once you hear what the end buyer wants as a reduction in price, then you go to the seller. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I can take on this eviction, so you don't have to worry about it. I'll pay for everything. I'll close on the property with the tenant or squatter in there, even though they don't want to move out. They're refusing to move out. They're saying evict me, then I'll get out. I'll take that on. I'll take on that headache. No problem at all. However, I'm going to need a reduction in price because it's going to cost me time and money to get this done. All right. So that is a great way to be able to wholesale the property with a tenant or squatter through the eviction process. And what I mean by the eviction process, either have the seller take care of the eviction before you close, or you take on the eviction, okay? And what I mean by you take on the eviction, you ask for a reduction, all right? And you'll be able to make a little bit more money that way as well because you're solving a problem. Believe it or not, sellers don't want to go through that, okay? They just want to get rid of the property, especially tired landlords. Oh my goodness, I can't tell you. They want nothing to do with it. because the process is a pain. They rather get paid now, okay? And it doesn't have to be a tired landlord. It can just be, somebody who's owned the property, a family member who's owned the property, and they let their cousin or uncle or sister or brother stay in it, and the sibling that's staying in the property, they're not holding up their end of the bargain, right? They're not paying the rent, or they're not paying the mortgage. They're not paying the property taxes. They're not paying the insurance. They're not, doing the maintenance on the property. So now it's become a burden to that seller to keep up with the property. They don't want nothing to do with that. Hair, just get it out my hair. I don't want nothing to do with it. They are not going to care about a reduction. They just want to get the property out of their hair, okay? And you are solving their problem by going up to them and taking on that property with a tenant or a squatter. I also want to mention that evictions are a lot easier with month-to-month tenants. Just like cash for keys are, evictions are a lot easier when it comes to month-to-month tenants, because then if the tenant is 3 months into their lease, you can't evict the tenant, because they're 3 months into their lease. However, if they are month-to-month or there's no written lease, then it makes the eviction a lot easier. That's why it's very important when you come across these properties, you ask the seller for the lease or an estoppel letter, okay? So you want to make sure you ask that seller for a lease or estoppel. So estoppel, all the estoppel letter shows, it basically gives you lease. It basically gives you all the details of that lease, like how often are the monthly payments, how much is the deposit, if there was any advance rents paid, just everything that's in the lease is going to be in that estoppel letter. And make sure that the title company gets on that. The title company is somebody who will basically chase down the seller for that. So when you come across these properties that have tenants inside, if it's a squatter, there's no lease. All right, if there's a squatter, there won't be any lease. Okay, but if there is a tenant, all right, who is lawfully in there, they signed a lease, then you want to make sure you ask that seller for a lease or an estoppel letter, so you'll know how long that lease is valid and when it expires. It's very important. All right, so if you come across a property that has a tenant in there and they're only 2 or 3 months, inside the lease, then yeah, it's going to be a whole lot harder to basically wholesale that property to an end buyer, because they didn't put the tenant in there. They don't know what kind of tenant it is. So that's when really you have to get a serious reduction then if you're trying to wholesale a property with a tenant in there and they're only 2 or 3 months into their lease. Like, it's hard to find an end buyer that's going to take that on. But if they are, maybe they only got like a month left, at that point, you guys can just wait until a month. Like the closing date can be a month or 2 months, after the lease ends. Or, you know what I mean? Like you can just wait, you have more options, you have more flexibility versus somebody who's only a few months into their lease. All right, so it's very important to ask. And this is important on, extremely important on multifamily properties. Okay, when it comes to multifamily properties, you really need to gather the leases. All right, you need to get those estoppel letters so you know exactly what people are paying, the deposits, how long the leases are, if they're month to month. All right, when multifamily properties, you need to be asking these questions. Okay, so if you have to evict somebody, if you're able to evict somebody. So it's extremely important you do that. So the last thing I want to cover is the inspection period when it comes to wholesaling properties with tenants. So you know that when you're under contract, especially if you're assigning the contract, if you're wholesaling it, you definitely want to make sure you have your inspection period. That being said, When you have your inspection period, you're going to use that inspection period to get all of your cash buyers in to see the property, so they can give you their highest and best offer. All right. You want to make sure you do this inspection period or that inspection day to, for all your cash buyers to come in. You want to really try to make that like a 1 day thing. All right. Because it's going to be so difficult to go in and out of the property when there's a tenant. All right. Tenants, they don't want to be bothered, right? They're going to make it very difficult to sell the property. Most of them, there are some tenants who are very cooperative, but most tenants, they don't want to move out. They've been there for so long, they're comfortable there. When they find out that the seller is selling, they don't want to leave. So a solution for that is to make sure your inspection period is in 1 day, okay? It's okay to have a long inspection period so you can, shop it out to your cash buyers, but you want to make sure all your cash buyers know that the inspection is going to be on this day, okay? It's going to be on whatever day, but only 1 day, and they have one time to go in and see the property. They're not going to be able to go in and out. So they need to make sure they get everything done that day, make sure everyone knows. And even if say if you want a contractor to go in or whatever, make sure they're there that day too. Make sure your inspector is there if you have an inspector looking at the property. You just want to make sure that you get everything done in one showing, okay? You don't want to have people going in and out of an occupied property, all right? Because then it opens a can of worms as well, okay? It gets back to the seller that such and such are saying this or you're selling it for that. You just want to make sure you're there as well. Make sure you're at the property on that inspection day where you're having your cash buyers come in and out. You definitely want to make sure that your inspection is 1 day, all right? You want to make sure that's the case because it's already going to be difficult to wholesale a property with the tenant, and you don't want to make it harder than it already is. So make sure, that is something you're doing. Other than that, you are able to wholesale a property, okay, if it has tenants or squatters. You can do the cash for keys, you can do an eviction, and lastly, you want to make sure that you are showing the property to your cash buyers on a specific day and that day only. It's going to make it easier for you to wholesale that property with the tenant because that tenant is going to be reluctant to have people come in and out constantly every other day so you can wholesale that property. If I miss anything, please put it down in the comments of how else you can wholesale properties with tenants. It's going to help other people. I hope you got value out of this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next video.